Hey there Wargamers, Justin the Arm Painter here, and today we're going to be showing you guys how to paint power weapons. The power weapon that we're going to be demonstrating this technique on today is a Deathwing Terminator, Dark Angel power weapon. And I've already prepared it today by applying the silver to the surface here. If this was your miniature, you might want to get the silver that you would like to use, apply it to the surface, and go ahead and prepare it with a wash and let it dry. The airbrush I'm going to be using for today's tutorial is the Sotar 2020 from Badger. You can use any airbrush you'd like, just make sure you're comfortable with it, make sure it's got a fine enough spray pattern for you, and that you've got your PSI and your settings really honed in for what we're going to be working on. Today, the major paint that we're going to be utilizing first is going to be Cyan from Montana. I generally like to use Shock Blue Light, but we didn't have any at the shop, so this is what I'm going to be using today. Today we will also be using Minotaur Ghost Tint Plasma Fluid, as well as a white paint of choice. Anything will do. In this case, we're going to be using Montana Shock White, and we'll also be using some matte varnish and one of our natural hair detail brushes. To get things started here, we've loaded up our Montana Cyan into our airbrush. We're going to spray a little bit on the back of our hand first here, make sure we're getting the proper flow, and also make sure we clear any dry tip before we get started. Essentially what we're going to be doing here is applying some lightning streaks to the blade. We're also going to hit some of the high points, so we're going to be putting a little bit of a blue color here on the coil where the lightning streaks are emanating from. Now it's important to note that I've got my PSI on my compressor down low on this. I'm spraying very, very close to the model. When you're doing this, you're going to want to be very careful. You're going to want to not pull back on the trigger too quickly or too far. If you do this, you may get a whole bunch of paint coming out at one time. You may get spider webbing, which is where the paint hits and beads up and kind of emanates outwards, and you don't want that. You also don't want any crazy pooling. So use this as a lesson on patience. Get in here, have fun with it, and know that essentially you're putting in the first kind of shadow portion sort of the lightning arc here. We're going to be coming in later, and we're going to be adding in some hot spots. So kind of use that to your advantage when you're trying to determine where you want these to be. Now we're going to flip this over and do the same thing on the back here. It's important to kind of pay attention to where your lightning arcs hit the edge of the blade, because you want them to transition over and kind of look like they're wrapping around or connecting to other effects on the back side of the blade as well. Now if you happen to not get this perfect, it's fine, but it's one thing I like to do. With our blue lightning streaks now dry, we're going to come in with our white paint now. Now this has been loaded into the airbrush, and this is our Montana. Now we're going to be aiming for the high points on this blade, and we're not trying to hit necessarily the lightning arcs, but the high points where it's going to be the hottest. So we're going to be focusing on the edge of the blade here, and then also looking for hitting some of the high points on the coil as well. Now this is kind of similar to pre-shading. The next step that's going to come up is really going to pull all of the colors and so forth together. So bear with me right now while this may look kind of weird. Once we get to the next couple of steps, this is all going to come together and look very, very cool. Now in one breath I'll encourage you guys to be patient, and then I'll turn around and I'll speed up the footage here. But I really wanted to get you guys to see me finish up the high points on the blade here, so you kind of have an idea of what I was doing, so you can replicate the effects for yourself. But above all else, just be patient. This will all come together in the end. For the next step, we're going to be coming in by hand with some pure white paint. In this case, we're going to be using Vallejo Foundation White. Any white that you have will do, so long as it's thinned down. I do apologize for not mentioning this at the beginning of the video when I was doing the film segment. I totally forgot to grab this paint and showcase it, but I'm sure you have some white paint laying around on your desk. With our white paint thinned down, now it's time for us to come in here and create some high points on the lightning arcs that we put down earlier. First thing we're going to do here is we're going to come in and put a bit of a white dot on the coils here that the lightning is emanating from, and then we're going to trace the kind of piping that connects them to the bottom of the blade here, the handle. And essentially we're creating hot spots or high points on the blade. This is important because in an upcoming step we're going to be laying down the ghost tint, and the effect is really going to come together. We need these high points here so this stands out later. Remember when you load up your paintbrush that you can drag it across the back of your hand, your thumb, a paper towel to get excess paint out and form a tip. In this case, we have just enough paint to come across the edge of the blade here. We're just dragging the side of the paintbrush. We don't want to get a whole lot of paint here. And again, we're creating the hot spot on the weapon. In this case, instead of being just a high point, we're going down the edge of the blade here, because I imagine a power sword where the blade is just white hot, ready to cut through power armor, slice down the enemies of mankind, and we want to kind of convey that with our power swords as well. And rest assured, we will be coming in and working on the lightning bolts too. It might seem counterintuitive, but also flip this blade over when you're doing your power weapons, and also make sure you trace the edge of it with your white paint on that side as well. If you don't do that, I feel like you get a really dense amount of white from one angle and not from the other, and you kind of want this white to bleed over a little bit on the edges of both sides, so that no matter where you're looking at it from, it looks like a white hot blade ready to cut down its enemies. The hot portions on the edge of the blade now painted and the coils now painted, we can begin by working on the lightning arcs themselves. And we're going to come in here with some of this white paint, very gently kind of do like a shaky back and forth motion with our paintbrush here, and we're essentially trying to put a white arc in the center of the blue lightning arcs we created with the airbrush. We don't want to cover this completely. Like I said in the previous step, the blue is kind of sort of a shadow or a light emanating from the lightning, and the white portion here is going to be the hot spot. And don't be afraid to experiment with this a little bit. You don't have to follow every arc of the blue. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just imagine that you're creating depth by creating the high points where the white is, and if you transition over and leave a little bit of that blue showing and there's no white there, that's kind of a low point of the crackle. So have fun and play around. To spare you guys some time, I've sped this step up right here, but I wanted you guys to kind of see how it all came together, even though it is a little bit fast to take in. I do want to point out, though, that we are using thin down white in this case, and it may go down not quite as dense as you want, so don't be afraid to come in and do multiple thin coats, or after you've put down your white, if you feel like there's some spots that need to be more intense, go over those specific spots with the white again. As I've mentioned, this should be a fun thing for you to do, experiment, and have a good time crafting and creating your power weapon. Alright, with our hot spots, the edge of the blade, and the lightning arcs now all complete, all we have to do is let this dry and move on to the next step. For this step, we're going to be coming in with Minotaur Ghost Tint Plasma Fluid from Badger's Paint Line. Now it's important to note that I highly recommend you do multiple thin passes on this, and pay attention to the intensity of the color with each pass, and make sure you stop when you are happy. Because this is a translucent paint, every coat you put on is going to change the intensity of that blue. So make sure you flip it over and you apply the same amount of coverage to both sides so that your blade looks normal. Now in this case I went with essentially kind of one coat with a couple little touch-ups there, but I think this first pass is enough. Looks great. With our Ghost Tint Plasma Fluid now dry, we're going to come back in with our white paint by hand here, and we're going to trace the high points one more time, trying to leave some of that transition there. And I like to tackle the side of the blade first, just because I'm impatient. I want to see some of this come together very quickly, and I feel like hitting that edge first is really going to make things pop, and it makes me happy to look at it. It's important to note that when you are working with the Minotaur paint, if it has not been sealed, it will reactivate, which we're kind of using to our advantage here. Once this dries, the intensity of the white's going to be pulled down to kind of a pale bluish, sort of. Once you do this effect for yourself, you'll see what I'm talking about in person. But be aware that when you're working with any of the ghost tints from Badger's Paint Line, that this bleeding kind of effect is present, and sometimes, in the case of this power weapon, it is useful, and other times it can be a nuisance. So one of the last things we're going to do on this blade is we are going to seal it just so that in case it happens to get wet, we don't reactivate the ghost tint paint. But be aware that that is an effect that it has, and that you can use it to your advantage. In this particular case, we're only going to be doing one pass with the white here to bring the high points up and touch up the lightning bolts and hit the coils and so forth on the blade. But after we apply the matte varnish, in your case, if you wanted to come back, you could apply another extreme highlight with the white, which would be more pure white now that it's not mixing with the ghost tint, if that makes sense. So, as I've said previously in the video, when you're working with power weapons and ghost tints, make sure you have some fun, make it your own, and have a good time. This should be a fun kind of blending, interesting crafting experience for your weapon, for your miniature. Make this a one-of-a-kind sort of relic blade or chapter blade for your Space Marines. Then we're going to speed up the rest of the footage here as well, but I want you guys to kind of see, start to finish here, the steps that I take. Now we're going to come in and we're going to, again, re-hit all the high points and the high spots. So we're going to hit the coil, And then we're going to be putting some of that white at the extreme high points on all of these lightning arcs as well. Again, when you're doing this, make sure you leave some of the previous colors showing through, and you're focusing on the idea that this is the hot spot in the lightning, the hot spot on the coil, the hot spot on the edge of the blade. This white should be where everything comes together, the highest point, the brightest spot, the hottest space on this particular blade. With our white areas now reapplied and the hot spots now prevalent, the last thing to do is to seal this miniature. Now you could choose to use matte, or you could go with a gloss. It just depends on the finish that you might want. Now you might be thinking, this is already shiny, I shouldn't have to gloss varnish it if I want it to keep this sheen. Well, it's important to note that when you're working with the Minotaur paints here, that if they get wet again, they can rehydrate and bleed. So it's important to seal this with something. In this particular case, I'm going to be using the Vallejo matte varnish because I'd like to have a matte finish on my blade, but you could just as easily come in with a gloss varnish if you would like to. Now, in addition to applying a matte varnish, there's one final step if you choose to go that far with your particular power weapon of choice. You can go back in and apply an additional extreme highlight of white on the edges and the high points of the blade and the lightning arcs and the coils and stuff like that one more time. In this particular case, I went with a matte varnish because that's just kind of the finish I like, and it also does not show reflections when filming and taking photographs and stuff like that as well. So, but as you can see here, we've got these really cool lightning arcs across our blade, and I think the only thing left would be to paint up the rest of the details on the arm there and the bottom of the handle and slap it on a miniature.
Alright, with our matte varnish now dry, I think our power weapon is complete. Now this is just one way to approach power weapons, but we'd love to see what you guys are working on. If you happen to use this technique, other techniques, or mesh things together, make sure you share those with us. Check us out on Facebook, check out our Facebook group, The Tap Garrison, or maybe even tag us on Instagram. We really do like to see what you guys are doing. We love to engage with you, and seeing your miniatures helps motivate us to paint some personal models as well. So get out there and share some hobby love. If you're interested in helping us improve the quality of these videos, make sure you sign up in the comments below. Let us know what we can do to improve, what kind of content you would like to see, or what kind of techniques you'd like to see us focus on. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe, ding the little bell so you get alerts when we put up new content, and make sure you check us out over at deathraydesigns.com. Anything you do over there helps keep the lights on, helps keep me employed so I can continue to provide content for you guys. With that being said, folks, I think we're going to sign off for today. I'd like to thank you guys for coming with me on this journey. I hope you've enjoyed it so far. I've had a hell of a time painting up these miniatures and working on these tutorials for you guys. But as always, happy wargaming, and I will catch you in the next video.